Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Sarah Warren, founder and president of Oasis Center for Wellbeing, where we think in terms of wellness broadly defined, and we mean really broadly defined. This is the inaugural podcast that we've created called The Psych Lens, where we're focusing on how psychology can shed light on culture in general and pop culture in specific. And the reason that we're doing this at this point in time is because the last year and a half or so have really been tough. And we at Oasis have taken on a lot of the more challenging issues related to stress and uncertainty and isolation, the psychological effects of all of that, and broader issues in our society. And we decided that it's really time to try to lighten up for ourselves and also for other people to help kind of counterbalance all of that. In our first episode, we have decided to focus on a particular section of an episode from season 1 of the Emmy Award-winning show Ted Lasso. And for anybody who watches it, you'll understand that it's really quite psychologically oriented and rich, even though it is extraordinarily entertaining, which is why my husband and I started watching it, was because we were looking for something light. We've been tending to avoid some of the harder material that is available streaming. At first we thought it was really just kind of, light entertainment, and then as the show progressed, we really came to understand that there's a lot of richness to the material, which we think is really kind of intelligently, thoughtfully presented, and really gets into kind of the psychology of the characters. And it really kind of represents our notion of how psychology is relevant everywhere, that there is therapy that happens in the show, and actually it's therapy that I don't actually really approve of in terms of how it's conducted, which will be a topic for another day. But, they're taking on social issues, they're getting into people's life histories and how that kind of helps explain who they are. There is therapy in there, but that actually is not, at this point, our focus at all in terms of today's conversation. So we will talk about kind of what we think is about the psychology of how the show works, what makes it work. And then we will also talk about mental health in sports, which is a central backdrop to the plot for Ted Lasso. And then we'll also talk about kind of what the implications are for us as a broader society related to what's happening in athletics right now related to mental health. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I am going to turn over to my sidekick, Connor Leef, who has a master's degree in psychology and various passions that sort of get folded into what we're doing here in this podcast. So I will let him talk about why he wanted to do this podcast and why this particular topic for today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Warren. Very excited to get this podcast started and get it rolling. And yeah, like you said, Ted Lasso, really, the show just hits so many different things that I'm interested in and passionate about. And like you said, they really do a nice job of touching on different topics within mental health, which is particularly awesome because you don't always get that from pop culture, right? I mean, the pop psych is usually the stuff that is a little bit more fictional and exaggerated, but this I would say does not exaggerate too much in terms of the mental health aspect and
While being extremely funny.
Exactly, yeah. It's still very light. If you know Jason Sudeikis at all, that's, why I started watching the show. He was one of my favorite SNL cast members ever. He's always plays this sort of energetic, overly positive, lovable guy. And Ted Lasso is that to the nth degree. He's, all of that and then some. And so it's an easy show to watch, even if it's just on in the background, because like you said, it's light and it's funny, but still more so than just putting it on in the background. If you sit down and watch, you're really going to absorb a lot. And we're talking about something from the first season, but so far what I've gathered is the second season goes even more so into mental health. So I think this will be a great way to kick off the podcast and, likely touch on Ted Lasso in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. So unlike me, you are a sports fan.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
That's part of what you bring to bear to this conversation.
Right, yeah. Not necessarily soccer. I haven't been, the biggest fan in the past. Haven't followed it per se, but still, enjoy watching just any sports. And more so than that, just, if you played sports, you kind of can connect with the players a bit, and not even what they're doing on the field, but their interaction with each other, their interaction player to player as well as player to coach, right? So a lot of nice ways to connect to the show there.
Mm-hmm. So I am not a follower of sports, never have been. My husband does, avidly. But I do have a perspective that comes from not only being a practicing clinical psychologist for 30 years, but I served as the Midwest Regional Testing Psychologist for the NFL Program for Substances of Abuse. So I have spent time around individual elite athletes. And I have a point of view that comes from my work with them.
And so when exactly was your work with them? Because, later we'll get into how the landscape of mental health has shifted in sports.
Yeah. So mid to late 2010s. So
Okay. About a decade or so, we'll say.
Yeah, maybe a little bit less. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Perfect. So we'll get started then with setting up the scene.
Yeah.
How does that sound? Okay, so this scene that we're talking about in particular is the beginning of an episode. But to set it up, we need to go to the end of the last episode. So Jamie Tart is the star of Ted Lasso's soccer team, or football, as they say in England. So he's the star. He is their franchise player.
And the franchise player means?
The franchise player is really the person that is supposed to be there for the long haul and that they will build the team around. He's in Chicago, the reference would be Michael Jordan. He was very much so the franchise player, where even if we're moving other players around, we'll try to bring in somebody like Dennis Rodman, something like that. Doesn't matter. We're not moving Michael Jordan. He's a Bulls player for the franchise, hopefully for his whole career. So that's sort of the idea. And, you don't become that sort of player unless you are exceptionally talented, which Jamie is. But he also has some personality quirks, we'll say, where he doesn't really get along with his teammates because he's a very selfish player. And
he's a bully.
And a bit of a bully. So yeah, he thinks he is essentially like the god of soccer. Nobody really else has any say in. There's no coaching him at this point. At least there's no coaching him, and so mid-game in a very important match, right? Ted Lasso sits Jamie Tart, which would be like Jordan or, Tom Brady, LeBron. It would be like sitting one of these players, one of these massive stars in the middle of an important game. It just doesn't happen. And so it takes everybody by surprise, including Jamie. And he essentially pouts because of it. He doesn't take it well, which is to be expected from his character. So then that's how that episode ends. Then the episode we're speaking about begins the next morning at practice. And so Jamie shows up to practice and he's in his street clothes. He's, doesn't have his cleats on or anything. And
I'd actually forgotten that. It's interesting that he's in his street clothes.
Right, yeah. He's everyone else is sitting around in their warm-up stuff, again, ready to go out and practice. He's sitting there in his leather jacket and, clearly not about to participate, but is still there. So to me, that's sort of like, I'm going to come in just to show you I'm not going to be playing, right?
Mm-hmm. Thumbing his nose.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. So then Ted sees that, goes over to him, asks why he's not dressed, why he's not going to practice, and he kind of just says, I'm injured. I got an injury, or I don't feel up to it.
Hey, James. I heard you're not going to be able to run with us today. That true?
Yep,
Why is that?
because I'm hurt.
Really sorry to hear that.
Relax, Ted. It's just practice.
It's very clearly a reaction to being sat in the last game, and he's trying to put his foot down, but in a very, let's say, childish way, adolescent way, and it naturally Ted gets upset, right? He doesn't want any of his players to act that way, to treat him that way, and especially a player like this who's supposed to be like a leader on the team. So then Ted goes into this rant.
Hey, if you can't practice, you can't practice. You're hurt, you're hurt. It's as simple as that. But it ain't about that. At all.
And it's this practice rant, which I caught as a reference to a previous press conference that was held. You did not catch that, but then talk about this tweet that you saw.
Yeah. So when I saw the episode, I registered it as the coach being fed up with his prima donna player, and just putting him in his place. That was for me the beginning, the middle, and the end, and it made sense in the plot. So then I follow on Twitter
Peter Segal.
Peter Segal, who is the host of a Chicago-based show called Wait, Wait, and Don't Tell Me. He is very funny and very smart, and I think kind of a sports guy, and clearly has been watching Ted Lasso. So he puts out this tweet saying, I didn't get that scene. I got the Allen Iverson reference. I didn't know who Allen Iverson was. I didn't realize that there was some reference to the scene. He said, I didn't get what the point was. Was the point like, practice does matter, practice doesn't matter? And I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's, confusion there that I wasn't even aware of. So it becomes more multifaceted, which is why we decided to home in on this particular scene for our first episode, because there's this ambiguity to how to take it.
Right. And so I was in that same camp as Peter Segal, where I caught the reference. I knew Ted Lasso, the character, and Jason Sudeikis, were referencing this press conference Allen Iverson held back in, I believe it was 2003. It might have been 2002, but
A long time ago.
Either way, right. It was a long time ago, and it turned into a viral soundbite that was passed around. And so I knew as soon as Ted Lasso started that rant that he was referencing it.
If you can't practice, you can't practice. You're hurt, you're hurt. It's as simple as that.
If I can't practice, I can't practice, man. If I'm hurt, I'm hurt. Simple as that.
But it ain't about that. At all.
It ain't about that at all.
You're sitting in here, you're supposed to be the franchise player. And yet here we are, talking about you missing practice.
We sitting here, I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
But very much like Peter Segal, it didn't make any sense to me. Because this press conference was when Allen Iverson was on the 76ers in Philadelphia, and they are one of the best teams in the league. He's one of the best players in the league. Like Jamie Tart, he's their franchise player, or he's supposed to be at least. But similarly, he hears sort of rumors floating around that the team is trying to move him. And, he doesn't have the best relationship with the coach, supposedly. So he keeps hearing that they essentially want him gone, and that makes no sense to him. And so then he's asked about practice. Maybe it's because you weren't at a practice. So then Allen Iverson goes into this. It's just about 2 minutes, and he says the word practice famously 22 times in that short period. And so he's just repeating himself over and over, and he's really trying to get the message across that, this isn't about practice. This is about something else. He keeps going, practice? What about the game? What about the game I go out there and, I die for?
We're talking about practice. You understand me? Practice. Not a game.
Not a game.
Not a game. Not the game you go out there and die for.
Not the game that I go out there and die for.
Right? Play every weekend like it's your last, right? No, we talking about practice, man.
And play every game like it's my last. Not the game. We're talking about practice, man.
Practice. You're supposed to be out there. You're supposed to lead by example. You're just shoving that all aside.
I know I'm supposed to be there. I know I'm supposed to lead by example. I know that. And I'm not shoving it aside.
So the way the soundbite was cut and spread, it makes it seem like he doesn't care about practice. It's like, I go out and I'm one of the best players in the NBA and I'm leading this team. Why do you care if I don't go to practice? Or why do I even need to go to practice?
So here we are, Jamie. We're talking about practice. Not a game. Not the game. We're talking about practice.
We're talking about practice, man. We're talking about practice. We're talking about practice. We ain't talking about the game. We're talking about practice.
It comes off very selfish, very lazy, frankly, and just not the leader that you want on your team. And so that was the narrative that was pushed and that spread like wildfire. Like I said, this is potentially the first viral video that I was aware of. 2003, I'm, 8, 9, something like that, in third grade. And we just thought it was hilarious, right? And that's how it was presented, too. Mm-hmm. If you look up the funniest press conferences, this is always at the top. But like Peter Segal was mentioning in that tweet, if that was the message that AI was actually portraying, it made no sense in this scene, right? Because, like you were saying, Ted is upset with this player, so he wouldn't be going to this player and saying, referencing this speech that very famously degrades practice, right? So it made no sense. And I was very glad you sent me over that tweet because it sort of confirmed my confusion, right? Wasn't sure. I was looking around just like the players in the clip are looking at each other like, what is he doing, right? Because they've never seen Ted do something like that. And then they introduce a camera angle in this scene where it's sort of on a strong angle, we'll say, right? It's sort of a jarring angle. And
I missed this too.
so it's sort of a quick thing that's part of the rant, and hopefully it will be visible in one of these videos.
The only place that we get to play together, we got control over. Rest of the time, it's us 11 against those 11. We're talking about practice.
But we've never seen a camera angle like that, and we've never seen Ted react like this. So it's sort of...
So like he's out of kilter.
Right, and it just reinforces that to the audience. And I mean, it's kind of like this jarring scene, and it causes a lot of confusion, but the looks on the players' faces are almost like exactly how I looked. Like, does he know he's referencing AI? So that's what I was thinking. And then there's plenty of people, though, potentially even the majority that were watching this show that were in the same camp as you that didn't catch the reference at all, right? So really then, after you sent me that tweet, I realized there were 3 different camps. Your camp, right?
Ignorant about sports.
Well, we'll say not aware of the AI press conference, not aware that that's, sort of if I hear the word practice, the first thing I think of is Allen Iverson.
Wow.
So that's sort of, how this has all been in my head. And now the second group then is like me and Peter Segal, who got the reference, but had no backstory to why Allen Iverson was reacting this way and why he gave this interview.
Which Jason Sudeikis knew.
Which then brings us to the third camp, which we'll call the Sudeikis camp, which he was very much so aware of what Allen Iverson was going through at the time, and what exactly caused him to sit out of practice. And then once you have this information, it really changes the message of that soundbite. And so it's also interesting that soundbite, like I said, it's about 2 minutes, but the full press conference is over 30 minutes. So clearly there's a lot of context taken out there, right?
And that context includes?
So what had happened was Allen Iverson, a year prior, his best friend was murdered. And then during this time when he had missed a practice or, potentially 2 practices, it was because the murderer was on trial. And so, this was his best friend from when they were small, and even though it was a year in the past, not that a year is enough time to get over something like that, but I mean, the trial then just brings up all these emotions again. And, you're just really not in the headspace to be doing something to be at work in general. I mean, the team kind of made it seem like he was being a distraction by not going to practice, but I think it's very plausible that he would have ended up being a distraction because of what's going on. So he really had this sort of visceral reaction because he's mad that he sat out for it's self-care. He's taking care of himself, but then he's being questioned for that and even potentially punished for that, for being traded away, sent to a different team. And so that's why then it starts to make more sense where he says, but that's not what this is about. That's not what we're talking about at all. It's because he knows that they just want him gone. So they stir up this narrative that he's not coming to practices and he doesn't have a real reason. But he knows that's not it. He knows that they just, want him out.
And he does have a real reason.
He absolutely does. I mean, he, like we were saying, that's with that much emotional distress happening from, bringing up prior traumatic events in the present because of what I'm assuming is traumatic again, right? There's no way that he could have had gone to practice and, effectively helped his other teammates, and it really was in his best interest.
And you're also saying in the best interest of the team.
I believe so, yes, and I believe that's generally the case, right? Where if you're damaging yourself, you can only damage the people around you as well. I mean, it's like therapists are taught in school as well how important self-care is for themselves, because for therapists, psychologists, if they're not in the right headspace or if they're not taking care of themselves, then not only is that damaging for themselves, but they're not providing the proper therapy, right? The real
reckless.
work cannot be done right. It would be reckless. So it's really, I was young when it happened, but I have to imagine that this was very much ahead of his time in terms of prioritizing self-care in sports. So considering your work with the NFL, how would you say the landscape of mental health has shifted in sports from, we'll say a decade ago, and then even, from 2 decades ago?
So I think that sports has been historically pretty anti-acknowledging mental health challenges or acknowledging the importance of mental well-being. I think that there's really been a culture of, push through pain, play through pain, don't acknowledge it. And pain is both physical and mental.
Right.
And it's more conspicuous in some ways in terms of the physical pain, but I think part of the whole idea is sort of like, as an athlete, you're supposed to be tough and determined and undistracted, and particularly the more elite an athlete is, that it's sort of like, you're supposed to have this sort of superhuman capacity to focus no matter what. And so I think that there are a lot of forces within the culture of sports that kind of militate against acknowledgement of any kind of personal problems or distractions, struggles, needs. And I think that it sort of permeates both kind of like the coaches and the leagues and athletic departments and all of that, and then individual players or athletes have tended to feel like, well, I can't take a break. Like
Right.
I will be penalized. I will be thought less of. This will reflect on my, kind of athleticism and my mindset. And so I think that that's the backdrop. I think that there's been obviously some recognition that players struggle, but for instance, the NFL program for substances of abuse, which I started with, came into existence, I'm going to say about 25 years ago. So there was an acknowledgement that there might be some challenges, but a lot of it grew out of really how to ensure that players were not impaired, during the season, right? So it's about the business of sport, right? And protecting the asset, right, of the players. And I know the person who founded it, and I know that his own orientation was very compassionate towards athletes and their challenges and really wanting to support them. But I think that, from the standpoint of the league, it's more about, we need to make sure that our guys are ready and able to play and practice, So I think, and what I encountered when I was in that role was that there was a tremendous amount of trauma that many of these players had experienced. So not unlike Allen Iverson, right? They know people who have been murdered. It could be family members. It could be, gang violence. It could be domestic violence. Players witnessing, a dad, attempting to murder the mom, and the kid feeling like they have to intervene. Poverty, 4 kids sleeping in a bed, as teenagers and young adults, not little kids, sleeping in cars. A lot of brutality that they had never, many of them, ever talked to anyone about ever in their lives. So they literally were playing through their emotional pain.
Right. And yeah, so you mentioned that to me the other day, and it got me thinking about I don't think it's a coincidence that there's that strong of a correlation, right, between athletes that perform at such a high degree and having a traumatic past. We often are told about exercising and the benefits of that for your mental health, right? And a lot of people work through, like you were saying, that's how they work through their emotions. It's really their only outlet. And so I'd have to imagine, the more traumatic, the more you try to work through it and get to a point where, this is really your life. Like it revolves around.
Yeah, I think there can be multiple things in play. I think that if you come from sort of a fractured family, then, being on a team can kind of become your new family, and your coach can be, or coaches can be your kind of, substitute parents. There can be, a sense of accomplishment that might not be so easily found in other parts of the person's life. There can be a trauma defense of compartmentalization, where the way you deal with the experiences you've had is you just sort of like put them in a box, and you don't let yourself think about it, and you don't let yourself feel about it, and it works up to a certain point. the things that are in that box can also come back to bite you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are good at compartmentalizing, then you can sort of say, okay, right now I am focused on my sport.
Right.
And so you can tap into that capacity to compartmentalize. And then I think also sometimes I heard players talk about things like, I was a really angry kid. And hurling yourself around and into other people can be an outlet for intense rage that can make sense in terms of where you come from. So
Right.
so I think there can be a lot of factors that come into play in terms of why elite athletics might be something that could work for somebody who's been traumatized. Not that I want to suggest that all elite athletes have been, but
Right.
I think Simone Biles is a case in point, not just in terms of her having stepped away, which we'll come to in terms of where things are now, but she had a challenging childhood emotionally, and I think that she's probably one of those people who has a tremendous capacity to compartmentalize, and that has gotten her where she is. And then I think, I said it can come back to bite you. Like it works up to a certain point, right?
Right.
And that I don't know the whole backstory in terms of how she's worked on herself and worked with herself to be able to give herself permission to say, what, here I am at the Tokyo Olympics, and I need to step away because of my mental well-being. So even someone as talented as her, and I think probably as capable of putting things in that box and trying to throw away the key, it's like she found the key presented itself, and
Right.
Stuff started to kind of bubble out of that box in spite of her best efforts. And to her credit, she said, okay, this is what I need to do, and this comes on the tails of other elite athletes doing similar kinds of things just recently. I mean, we did some years ago have Brandon Marshall in the NFL, who was very forthcoming about his mental health challenges, particularly in relation to borderline personality disorder, and he started a mental health foundation to try to address stigma. But he was really kind of the exception to the rule.
Right.
And just recently, we have Michael Phelps, who's very clear about his longstanding troubles with depression, and he's really, I think, kind of a spokesperson on that. And Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles. And I think also the women gymnasts, have
Right.
also been talking about the psychological effects of what they experienced at the hands of Dr. Nasser, and also their sport, which covered for him,
Right.
and refused to acknowledge that these young women were being abused and psychologically harmed. So I think that we're kind of at a sea change moment right now, and I think that part of what's valuable about that, compared, say, to celebrity, movie stars and stuff, and musicians and all those kind of people who have these dramatic stories. Sometimes, they get into trouble with the law and they get sent to rehab and all that kind of stuff. Is that athletes, elite athletes in particular, are really seen as, strong and determined and
Right.
disciplined and all that kind of stuff. And it really sends a message like, we are all human, no matter how talented, no matter how driven, we all have an upper limit, and everyone has a carrying capacity that can be exceeded.
Right.
And that it's important to be able to acknowledge, what our limits are and not push past them, and to be able to say, yeah, I'm struggling, and also I would say related to that, and I need help.
Right.
Whether it's professional help or help from friends and family, that this is a really important kind of capacity, I would say, that we need to cultivate for ourselves, and that, with the pandemic, we have a parallel mental health epidemic that is, manifesting in terms of, 90,000+ opioid deaths in the previous year, which was, way up from prior to that. Kids are having major mental health issues in ways that they haven't before, in part because of the isolation of the pandemic and
Right.
the inadequacies of trying to learn virtually, which I witnessed very up close and personal with my 17-year-old, who could not learn online.
Yeah.
He just checked out and barely passed last year, and is still suffering the effects of the academic losses of that, and a loss of confidence, in himself as a
Right.
learner. So we have, a mental health epidemic with kids and with adults as well. And so I think that this is, a time when, as a society, we really need to pay very serious attention ourselves individually to what we need. And I think also, like at a public policy level, we need to be thinking about how do we, reduce barriers to access, and which can be, related to insurance and, other kinds of policy things, and also, stigma about
Right.
saying, I'm struggling, I need help.
Right. Well, on that note, I think as the stigma is kind of going away with, hopefully at least.
Reducing some.
Right. We'll say reducing with the realization of lowered expectations, I'd say. And that's not to say to have low expectations, but when somebody like, Simone Biles sits out, she's not meeting the expectations of all of her viewers who expect her to push through anything
Yeah.
to get the job done, right? And so as more people realize that that's just not realistic, and that these super athletes are human as well, hopefully their expectations change, and then that changes, the stigma behind it. So.
Yeah, and I think that part of what her story represents is, she sat out for a couple of days.
Mhm.
It was not by any means the end of her career.
Right.
Her ability to perform. She came back, and she came back strong.
Mhm.
And so, I think that that's important too, that it's sort of like, just because you have mental health problems doesn't mean it's like all over,
It probably helped her career, because if she's those days that she sat out in a sport like gymnastics, I mean, if she's not fully concentrated on what she's doing, it could be a serious injury or something, right? And so then it would affect the rest of her career. So really prioritizing self-care is prioritizing your career, whatever you are ultimately taking a break from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you might be able to do for yourselves in this moment in time. So we want to encourage you to check in with yourself and see what you need. See if you're feeling stressed, distressed, overwhelmed. Do you need a break? of some sort. And a break could be stepping back in some more significant way, or it could just be sort of like, finding a TV show that you like, that makes you laugh. And laughter is a real tension reliever. Not just, that's sort of obvious, but like it actually is true scientifically. Finding a TV show that you can watch with other people. Maybe, there are people in your pod and, you decide that it's okay to sit together and watch TV together. Maybe you do it masked. Maybe, it's only with friends who are vaccinated. Maybe you do it virtually, right? So you're all watching at the same time. During the screening of Ted Lasso, there's a whole lot of hashtag Ted Lasso on social media. A lot of people are watching at the same time and commenting with each other. Doesn't have to be a TV show, could be something else, but just something that really helps you feel lighter. So we want to invite you to check in with yourself and figure out what you need and kind of, lighten your load.
Yep. Well, thank you, Dr. Warren. And
Thank
I'm
you, Connor.
very excited for this podcast and to see the reaction to this episode, but then also, where this podcast ends up going and future episodes.